All right, welcome to our next lesson. So in this one we're going to be talking about what's called the Battle for the Atlantic. This is an interesting name because usually when we think of battles we think of kind of just a pitched thing that, well, goes for a couple days. Again, I addressed this a little bit in World War I, or say with the Battle of Stalingrad, where those battles essentially go on for months. It's just like where they just locked on to each other. I was referencing World War I, things like Verdun or the Somme, just like battles that went on for months. Well, in this case, the Battle of the Atlantic goes on for years. Basically, to describe the Battle of the Atlantic, it starts when the war starts, pretty much. And it ends when the war ends, pretty much. Basically, it's a 6-year-long battle, and it ebbs and flows. At times, the Allies are doing all right, feeling like they got the upper hand. At times, the submarines, or basically the German U-boats, feel like they have the upper hand. And it's just back and forth. And I really shouldn't say submarines and U-boats. I mean, that's what takes over after a while. I should just basically say the German Navy, because I didn't start with the U-boats as much. I'll be getting into that a little bit. But there was just this ebb and flow, like no one really knew who was going to be on top and who was really winning, who had definitively won. It was just this back and forth, and that's why they just called it the Battle of the Atlantic. It was this constant struggle for who was dominating the seas in a way. And when we talk about dominating the seas, the focal point of the Battle of the Atlantic was around just one main idea, and that was to starve the Allies out. Meaning, look at this map and you see where Great Britain is. Great Britain's, as far as the world is concerned, a smaller place, yet it had this gigantic empire. And later on you get the United States joining in the war in 1941, but this essentially starts around 1939. But Britain, in order to keep their war, keep the war going, basically keeping their resources in place, be able to build more stuff, bring enough food, just be able to make war in a way, they had to bring all these resources from down there in the Indian Ocean, like Africa, Australia, India, then over from the Americas, like Canada is bringing stuff over, and it would all just filter in towards Great Britain. Either they're traveling around South Africa and up the western side of Africa there into Great Britain, or they're coming from Canada straight across. And in a lot of cases, you could say from Indonesia and Australia, they actually cross the Pacific Ocean and come up through the Panama Canal and then cross the Atlantic that way. Anyways, lots of different routes, but they all essentially culminate at Great Britain. Well, the Germans rightfully saw that one way to cripple Britain, maybe even take them out of the war, was to sink a lot of those ships bringing in supplies that Britain relied on. Now, just in peacetime, Britain relied on, as I say there, around 4,000 ships total, just constantly coming in and going out, bringing stuff in, bringing stuff out, to keep their empire afloat, pardon the pun. So when it comes down to it, the Germans needed to attack that shipping. They needed to destroy those ships. If they could, they would probably bring Britain to its knees and win the war that way. And especially after the fall of France in 1941, well, that's Britain was all alone at that point. They were the only ones standing against Hitler and the Nazis, you could say. Now, at this point we need to talk a little bit about the German mentality. So we just talked about how the British rely on the shipping, and the whole focus of the Battle of the Atlantic is really, can the Germans sink enough of those ships to just starve Britain out of the resources that they need to continue on with the war? Well, I'm going to stop here and go towards the Germans, because the Germans, specifically Hitler in a lot of cases, and in fact mostly I'm going to be talking about Hitler, had a bit of a romantic idea of what the German Navy was going to be like. Thinking back to World War I, and something that I have not done a lesson yet, and maybe I'll be able to do sometime next year, at least as of the time I'm filming this lesson, is we didn't really talk about the Battle of Jetland, which is a big one, and that's probably one I shouldn't have skipped, but time-wise we didn't really get to that one. But it's the epic battle. It's considered the epic battleship battle, where you get these massive ships from the British Navy and these massive ships from the German Navy, and just hundreds of them all coming in and going at it with each other. Something you can only be dreamed of. And really, there's just that one battle where that happens, is what's called the Battle of Jutland. There's this titanic struggle. And in the battle, the British lost more ships, but they won a strategic victory against the Germans, where the Germans had to withdraw. And so it was seen that the Battle of Jetland was this win for the British in World War I. Well, that always kind of grated Hitler and many of the other Germans that always viewed World War I as just this farce. That shouldn't have happened. If things were done the right way, we would have won everything, including the Battle of Jutland. And so in Hitler's mind, and again, many others, especially in the German Navy, thought that, we should build this massive fleet again that can go toe-to-toe with the British Navy. This time we'll have more ships. This time we'll have the upper hand. Well, not the upper hand. We'll have the level playing field that we deserve. And we will beat the Royal Navy head-to-head. So for that reason, they were building at the time, before World War II starts, or just before World War II starts, or they said plan to build 21 massive battleships. I think it was called Plan Z. Anyways, forget about that. I'm forgetting my names at the moment there. But they projected to be finished all these battleships by like 1946 or 1947. And by the way, World War II ends in 1945, so it's telling you it's going to take a long time to build all these ships, along with all the destroyers and cruisers and things that go along with it. The type of boat that was effective in World War I, but people kind of overlooked it, even in Germany they overlooked it, were what are called U-boats, or submarines. Now, they had a good amount of submarines going into World War II in 1939. When I say a good amount, I think they had like 100 or so. Not all of them could go out and operate and do what they needed to. Needed some fixing up, but decent amount, I guess you could say. But that's what they were at. And actually, the one area where the Germans were lacking when they started World War II, or at least World War II in the western side of the world, in Europe, is a navy that could go toe-to-toe with Britain. They had this massive army. They took out Poland. They can take out France. They seem unstoppable, and they don't have a navy to basically project that power over against towards Britain. Now, we mentioned this and talked this a little bit when we talked about the Battle of Britain, and how the Germans, they needed to figure out what they could do about the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy. That was a thorn in their side. They couldn't just project themselves across the world until that threat had been dealt with. So basically what the Germans decided to do was like, all right, we don't have a fleet, so we're going to act like pirates. We're going to send out what surface ships we have, we're going to send out what submarines we have, and we're just going to go in and sink as many ships as we can, and we're not going to go into a major conflict or confrontation with the British Royal Navy as of yet. We need to starve the British out, they'll be out of the war, and then we can build our massive navy freely. So, now, in that last slide I talked about how they focused on the U-boats. I'm going to get to that in a second. First off, we need to talk about how, again, there was this focus on surface ships. It's kind of this romantic idea that Hitler and many of the other Germans have. Our ships can take out the British ships head to head. And so, but again, they don't have enough of them yet, so they use them almost like pirate ships. And they have a couple, how would I put it, fun escapades in the beginning. Like I have here the tale of the Graf Spree that just quickly, I'm not going to go into too many stories here, and I apologize because there's some pretty good ones when it comes to Battle Atlantic. There's 6 years of stuff. By the way, new movie that just came out. I have not seen it yet, although I very much want to, called Greyhound. Is all about this. I can't really suggest to go see it, but I'm excited to see it because I'm hoping it has a lot of good content, you could say, for my class. Another good movie, by the way, that goes along to showing what this was like or how kind of tense the Battle of Atlantic is a movie called U-571 that came out a couple decades ago. Anyways, back to this. What I was getting at is the Germans thought, okay, we're going to send out our ships as kind of like pirate ships. Submarines are definitely like pirate ships, but we're going to send even our battleships out like that. So these battleships would kind of run the gambit. They'd be able to sneak past the Royal Navy here and there, get out into the open ocean of the Atlantic like the Graf Spree does. I know I'm not saying that right, by the way, but at least in the German way of saying it. And it does some pretty good damage. The problem is the British followed it. Even though they couldn't really catch up to the Graf Spree, the Spree was a ship that was actually very fast but had the armament of a battleship. The idea was it could run away from ships that could take it out, but it could easily catch up to and kill any ships that, it could catch up and take out that it wanted to. But the Germans were able to corral it actually down around Uruguay. And the crew of the Grass Free there basically sought asylum in Uruguay, in Montevideo, Uruguay, and then scuttled their ship, meaning they sunk their own ship there. And so the Germans looked at it as like, well, it was nice to send it out there. It did some damage, but the whole idea of like from the ships it sunk to we lost that battleship, that didn't seem like it was actually a fair trade. They were hoping to get a lot more damage out of the ship than they got out of it. So they're starting to rethink things a little bit. Then they moved to saying, okay, let's send out a full battle fleet, at least the biggest thing we can send out, just to be kind of this pirate fleet out on the high seas. And it was led by a brand new battleship called the Bismarck, arguably the best battleship of World War II at this point in 1940. And it was a ship that the British were rightfully to be scared of. Along with other ships, again, I'm saying this wrong, Prince Eugen, it looks like Prince Eugene if you read it in English. They set out and they're able to get past the British Royal Navy screen. They almost get out to open ocean. By the way, I'm summarizing one of the more epic tales of all World War II history, the tale of the Bismarck, by the way. I'd highly suggest going to look this one up. I'm sorry I'm not taking the time to tell you here on this online lesson. I apologize. Basically, long story short, it's an epic chase. The Royal Navy finally is able to, luckily, and I do mean luckily, take out the Bismarck. And they sink the Bismarck. In fact, here's a slide of the Bismarck down at the bottom of the ocean. It's one of those ships kind of like the Titanic, where finally when they had good enough submarine technology, you can go down and research it and look at it and things like that. But once the Bismarck goes down, finally it's just kind of like, oh crap moment for the Germans. Like, we're building these massive ships. That took years to build. And in just the first, just our first foray out into what it needed to do in sinking shipping, it just didn't get the job done. So, and that was a lot of manpower, that was a lot of men lost, that was a lot of wealth, just kind of, and resources, just bottom of the sea. So they rethink their strategy. They've been using U-boats, meaning submarines, the entire time of the war. They've been fairly effective. But everybody kept overlooking them like, they're not that great. Sonar can pick them up. If you guys know what sonar is, it's a way to detect ships underwater, just like radar is for planes in the air. That just basically submarines were overlooked, except for by a guy named Admiral Donitz. I think I'm saying his name right. Again, I doubt it. But after the sinking of the Bismarck, he was able to get the German Navy to focus on the idea of like, okay, we're going to go away from the surface ships. We'll still continue building some of the surface ships we have, like a ship called the Tirpitz or Tripitz. God, I can't believe I'm forgetting this right now. It's a sister ship to the Bismarck. So they can still have a home fleet to guard them just in case. But when it comes to sinking the shipping that they desperately need to do to take Britain out of the war, they're going to rely solely on submarines. And one of the things that actually helped out a lot was, again, like I said earlier, they had about 21 battleships set up to be, 21 battleships to be built, which at this point they have 2. They end up scrapping almost all the others except for one. And it turns out that you can build dozens of submarines out of the materials it would take just to build one of those battleships. And so instead of getting, 15 more, 16 more battleships, 17, 18 more battleships, you're getting hundreds of submarines. And all of a sudden you get this massive fleet of submarines out in the Atlantic Ocean. And especially after France goes down, well, that changes the game a bit. So, just to give you an idea of how this changes the game. There's a quote from Winston Churchill where he says, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Meaning he understood that how many ships were being sunk by these U-boats. And if you're looking at that map, it's one of the better maps I could find just in a short time here. But all those green dots are sunk merchant ships trying to bring supplies or men and materials over to Britain to continue on the war. Every red dot you see on that map, again, if you can see that okay, are submarines that do get sunk. And holy cow, there are a heck of a lot more green dots. Now, when the Germans lose a submarine, it's not as, it's a big deal, but it's not as big of a deal as losing the Bismarck, losing a battleship. Because in a way, you lose a submarine, that's about the same men and materials you're losing as, say, the merchant ships you're losing. So if you have a submarine that sinks 10 ships, then it gets sunk. That was a fair trade-off. I know it sounds bad. I'm talking about the idea there's lives lost here, but from that macro vision of the war, that was a fair trade-off. Whereas with the Bismarck, it was not a fair trade-off. They didn't get any ships sunk with that one. Merchant ships, I should say. And they were hoping to get hundreds of ships to make that cost-benefit ratio, however you want to call that, work out for them. But the submarines, holy cow, did they do some damage. Now, that map you're seeing there, that's from later on in the war when the submarines are just at will, sinking what they can. And they're just camping out even off the coast of the Americas. That's the reason why I use this map specifically. Like, if you haven't heard these stories before, like, people would wake up, look out their window, like in places like New York or Boston or Charleston or New Orleans, and just see a U-boat just patrolling in the ocean out their window, like a shark out there, and it just freaked people out. Like it brought sheer terror into a lot of people. Like, the Germans are going to come slit the Nazis are going to come slit my throat tonight, or something like that. Anyways, we don't hear that talked about as much, but that was a huge fear for people. Anyways, that is just one map. I use actually a lot of different maps in class to show just the progress of how all these ships get sunk between the years 1939 all the way through 1945. And it's staggering. These U-boats just really do a good job of just destroying tons of stuff. The Allies respond. Man, they do this at the beginning of the war, but they come up with different tactics that kind of help out here and there. And the main thing, though, that they have to keep going to is the convoy system. In the beginning, though, the Battle of the Atlantic, one of the problems of the convoy system is they didn't have enough surface ships to guard them. It's one of the reasons for what's called the Lease Act, where President Roosevelt of the United States lends 50 destroyers to the British Royal Navy in return for certain concessions and the ability to use bases. It was basically a way to help out Britain without saying we're going to war, and everybody knew it. But even that wasn't enough, it felt like, to deal with this U-boat threat. They were sinking a lot of stuff, and especially once the U-boats start forming into what are called wolf packs, meaning where they would coordinate between themselves and attack a convoy. Sometimes with over a dozen, maybe even 24 submarines or more. Very few cases where you have more than that. But they could wreak some pretty good havoc on these convoys, where you're like a herd of deer. You're just pick off the weak ones, go in there and scare them, make them scatter, just like those same tactics. And the term wolf pack is really appropriate here, and they do a lot of damage. So the Allies are just kind of like, they're losing a ton. And by the way, when you get into 1942, 1943, and the United States is in place, and our shipyards are going full bore, and we're producing, holy cow, tens of thousands of ships, by the end of 1942, the beginning of 1943, it's looking like we won't build enough ships to overcome how many ships we're losing to the German U-boat menace. Like, this was a bad deal. What turns the whole game around, in which there's a nice movie that was made a couple years back called Imitation Game, is when the British find they're able to capture and then crack what is called the Enigma. Basically, the code that is sent between the submarines and the German High Naval Command in coordinating or saying where they're at, or to give and send, give orders, receive orders, and things like that to the captains of the submarines out there. The British build was arguably the first computer in the world, a place called Bletchley Park. That's a picture of, I believe that's a picture of it in the bottom right there. I assume it is. That's what it said it was. So we'll go with that. And that was basically computed, or was able to crack the code of the Enigma, because it was always changing. And once that code is cracked, the Allies were able to know when wolf packs were about to attack and to avoid them here and there. They're able to find German submarines, traveling on the surface, and they're able to send in planes, new planes, long range, basically sub-attack planes. I could take them out, and those are all a lot of pictures of just that happening. And this became a really bad time for the Germans. They will lose over 50 submarines in a matter of just over a month after this happens. That was pretty bad for them. They have to pull back a little bit. But they also innovate. They come up with some new strategies and new submarines that are much better off. And by the end of the war, it looked like they might be turning things around a little bit, but that was by the end of the war. At that point, the Allies had already landed at Normandy. They'd already liberated France, and they were really pushing hard into Germany. If that hadn't happened, if the Allies hadn't invaded Europe yet, or basically France, and getting into Germany, who knows how this might have turned around with new German innovations and things like that. Like I said, it's just this ebb and flow that was the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, one of the main reasons why this is important in knowing about the Battle of the Atlantic is that once you get to that mid to tail end of 1943 and the Battle of the Atlantic shifts more in the Allies' favor, this is when we can really start sending over men and materials to prepare for D-Day, to prepare for the invasion of Europe. And so if that didn't happen, it was hard to get all the stuff we could over there. We definitely didn't want to send troop ships without a proper amount of protection, being destroyers around them. But then also you need to send ships that have all the gear that they need, the tanks, the artillery, just the weapons, the food, everything else, which are usually the ships that you left on the outsides that you knew you could kind of afford to lose. You did not want to lose your troop ships, but you needed all of it to basically make that invasion work. And so once the U-boat threat was a little bit neutralized in 1943, that really ramped up the ability to do, well, D-Day in 1944. Anyways, I'll stop at this point. Again, one last thing I'll say is I really browsed over this. There are a lot of stories that go along with this, some crazy, unbelievable stories that go along with the Battle of the Atlantic and what happens between ship captains and submarine captains and just this. Well, anyways, I would highly recommend looking stuff up yourself. And with that, I'll see you in the next lesson.